Shabbat Shalom, everybody. In the last discussion we had on Isaiah chapter 52 and 53, we went over the text in detail, line by line, starting in Isaiah 52:7 and working our way down through Isaiah 53:12. And our goal was to do that and also examine the other servant songs in the book of Isaiah, the other four, in detail, and try to determine of whom does the prophet speak, as the famous question in Acts chapter 8 is posed. Now, I didn't say everything I really wanted to say about that issue last week. And what I mean by that is that whenever you do a good teaching like this, there's always, and you have everything in your mind, but there's so much material to cover that when you're done and you go back and you listen to the tape, you want to go shoot yourself because he's like, just shoot me. Because there's a tendency to forget things, to include important information that you just, you wish you could go back in time and slide that into the tape. So what we're going to do here before we go into our topic today, because this tape's topic, and this lecture's topic, is the rabbinic literature and what the ancient rabbinic literature, or the ancient Middle Ages even rabbinic literature, has to say about the figure of Isaiah 52 and 53. How does that literature, how did our ancient sages understand, by and large, Isaiah 52 and 53? But before we do that, I want to re-examine the text of Isaiah 52 and 53 and emphasize some things that I inadvertently did not emphasize last week. The first is in the identification of the servant. Now, if you go look in Isaiah 49 and verse 3, there's a passage here, or a verse here, which is has a great deal played upon it by the anti-missionaries. Verse 3 says, "And said unto me, You are my servant, O Israel, in whom I will be glorified." Okay. This passage seems to be an open-shut case in favor of the anti-missionaries. They say, aha, Isaiah tells us who the servant is. It's right here in chapter 49, verse 3. It says that the servant is Israel. Of course, if you read a few verses down, you'll find out that this has to be allegorical, because in the following verses it's impossible for the servant to be Israel, because the servant redeems Israel. In verses, especially in verse 7, and especially in verse 7 where it says, "And the nation abhors," okay, whom the nation abhors. The nation abhors the servant. Now what nation? Well, contextually the nation here is the nation of Israel. That's a real problem for the anti-missionaries, because that means that Israel abhors Israel. And this also doesn't fit with the overall context in this passage, because it is Israel that redeems Israel and preserves Israel in these verses. Okay? So, what do we do? My goodness, what do we do? We can't have the nation of Israel abhorring the servant if the servant here has to be Israel, based on Isaiah 49:3. So we'll just change it. And if you look in the Sonicho translation, or in the Jewish Publication Society translation of 1917, I don't have the more recent translation from the Jewish Publication Society handy, but the version I grew up with says, or the version I've had since I was a boy at least, says in verse 8, "Thus says the Lord, in an acceptable time have I answered," oh, that's verse 8, I'm sorry. "Thus says the Lord, the Redeemer of Israel, his Holy One, to whom is despised of men, to whom is abhorred of nations." Plural. Now, if you look at the Hebrew, you'll see that the underlying Hebrew word here in question that's being translated nations, plural, is goy. And what does goy mean? Well, in modern Hebrew, of course, when we refer to a goy, we refer to a Gentile, but that's not always the case in biblical Hebrew. The word goy in biblical Hebrew just means nation. There's times when the word goy is applied to Israel. For example, in Genesis, we're told that Abraham would become a great nation. And the word is goy. Okay? Same thing in the Torah where we read the blessings that were given to Ephraim and Manasseh. We're told that Ephraim would be a great nation. Goy. Okay? All right, now, the word goy then is singular. The plural form is goyim. That would be nations. Okay? So the Jewish Publication Society translators and the Sonicho version translators have fudged. They didn't want it to say nation. That would be a dead giveaway that the servant isn't always isn't always Israel, even within the same text of Isaiah 49. And so, in order to prevent that, they just change it. It's not a problem. It's easy. Just change it. What are you doing? Just change the Word of God to suit you? How is that? How do you do that? How do you just change the Tanakh? This is something that Rabbi Singer harps on when it happens, or when he feels like it has happened, by the missionaries and the writers of the New Testament, when he feels like they have changed the text. By the way, they haven't. I consistently go through and have gone through in this whole series and shown that nobody was changing the text. They were using alternate texts, but there was nothing devious going on. There's a clear doctrinal reason that goy gets translated in the plural form here instead of the singular form. It's obvious doctrinal reason, and it changes the entire meaning of the text. Now we have the Gentiles abhorring the servant, which fits very well with the anti-missionary interpretation of Isaiah 53. Instead of the nation abhorring the servant, which is impossible with the impossible to fit with the anti-missionary position on Isaiah 53. Can't be done. The nation can't abhor the servant if the servant is the nation. Okay. So I want to make that very clear here. And then I want to look at something else. Now, let's stop here. While I'm still looking at Isaiah 49:3, there's something else that I keep failing to mention. Although in Isaiah 49:3, Isaiah identifies the servant as Israel, there are other passages in the book of Isaiah in which he assigns other persons or entities the role of the servant. Okay? Or gives them the title of the servant. For example, in Isaiah chapter 20, verse 3, "And the Lord said, like as my servant Isaiah has walked." You see? Chapter 20, verse 3. There, Isaiah is the servant. Elsewhere in Isaiah, even King Cyrus, the Gentile King Cyrus, is referred to as the servant. So the role of the servant changes throughout the book of Isaiah. There are times where the servant is Israel. There are times when it isn't. There's times where it's Isaiah. There's times even where it's the Gentile King Cyrus. And there are times, clearly, where it is the Messiah. Now, let's look at Isaiah 53. We've already looked at Isaiah 53 in detail. By the way, if you look at the Koren Study Bible, the Koren Jewish translation, on Isaiah 49:7, you will see an honest translation of that passage. You'll see that the Koren Bible actually honestly translates that passage that the nation abhors the servant. Now, the problem is, the Corn Bible is not so honest in Isaiah 53:8, even though the Jewish Publication Society translation and the other translations that I'm aware of, the other Jewish translations, are honest on that passage. Isaiah 53:8 presents quite a problem. The standard Jewish apologetic on this passage, on Isaiah 53, historically has been the speaker was God. Okay, it couldn't be Israel. Couldn't be Isaiah. If it was Isaiah, then the we in those passages was Israel. You see, throughout Isaiah 52 and 53 particularly, there's a big contrast between he and we. He is constantly being compared and contrasted with we. He is the servant, we is the speaker. They can't be the same because they're being contrasted throughout the book, or throughout the chapter. Okay? So they cannot be the same. Therefore, it is important for the anti-missionaries that Isaiah not be the speaker, and that Israel not be the we that Isaiah speaks of, which is obviously what the case would be. If Isaiah was the speaker, then whenever it says we would be Israel. We, Israel, would be contrasted with he, the servant. And this is a big problem for those that want to make the servant Israel, because you can't have that. You can't be contrasting Israel with Israel. Okay. So, the problem that they have had historically is that the text clearly says, all we like sheep have gone astray. The iniquity of us all has fallen upon him. Okay? He was crushed because of our iniquities in verse 5. All through this text, the speaker has iniquities. The speaker has gone astray. Therefore, the speaker cannot be God. Okay? The speaker cannot be God. Now, the new revised position, now I'm going to say this and then somebody's going to come forward and show me some ancient document where the Gentile kings were proposed as the speaker even at some very early date. And that may well be the case. But it's my understanding that this is a more revised position. And that is that the Gentile kings of the last verse of Isaiah 52 are the speakers of Isaiah 53. Again, impossible, because the text specifically tells us that they cover their mouths, that they have nothing to say. They're not the speaker of anything. Moreover, there's a chiastic structure in verse 10, in Isaiah 52:10, that connects the salvation that's being revealed, identifies it with the arm, his holy arm. That salvation that's being revealed takes us up to verse 7, Isaiah 52:7. In Isaiah 52:7, we have a person whose feet are upon the mountains, who is making known a message that deals with salvation. Okay? That's in verse 7. Then you go down to verse 10, and that message that relates to salvation is identical in the poetic structure. It's a poetic structure called chiasmus, which is kind of like what we call parallelism. You make a statement, and then you make the same statement in reverse sentence order, with a paraphrased in reverse order. That's what you have in verse 10. Okay, so in verse 7, it says, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger of good tidings, that announces peace, the harbinger of good tidings, that announces salvation, that says unto Zion, your God reigns. Okay, so he's announcing salvation. And then in verse 10, the Lord has made bare his holy arm in the eyes of all the nations. And then it repeats backwards, and the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. So the salvation spoken of, that's being seen in verse 10, is the holy arm that's being made bare also in verse 10. They're identical. They are poetically identified with each other. And then, in chapter 53, verse 1, Who would have believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? There you've got synonymous parallelism, poetic structure in which our report is being identified with the arm of the Lord being revealed. Well, the arm of the Lord being revealed is the same thing as the making bare the holy arm in verse 10, which is the same thing as our salvation, the proclamation of salvation in verse 10 and in verse 7. This means that the speaker of Isaiah 53 is the individual standing on the mountains in Isaiah 52:7. Has to be. It's very clear from the poetic structure of the text. And nobody's theology identifies that individual as the Gentile kings. Now, all of that aside, that individual could be Isaiah, okay? But it could not be. There's just no way I can see that that individual could be read into that individual is the Gentile kings that don't even come up until chapter 52, verse 15. The Gentile kings are reacting to the message. They're not giving it. Okay. Now, the sentence structure and the structure of the whole thing is such that they're reacting to the message that the servant is given, about the servant that's being given by the individual standing upon the mountains. All right. This takes us to 53 verse 8. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and with his generation who did reason? For he was cut off out of the land of the living, for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due. Now this word, my people, is very important. My people, and it appears as his people in both of the copies from the Dead Sea Scrolls. There were two complete Isaiah scrolls found in Cave 1 at Qumran. Of those two complete Isaiah scrolls from Cave 1, we have a good text, a very good Qumran text of Isaiah. And both copies have his people here, not my people. However, that just opens up more dimensions to things which we talked about last week, his people versus my people. I don't want to get into that right now. What I do want to get to is that the Hebrew here in the Masoretic text that's being translated by the Koran Study Bible is Ami. Okay? Ami. Any of you that know even the least bit of Hebrew know that the yud suffix on the end of a word, that e on the end, means people. Am-e means my people. There is no way to understand it but my people. So why does the Koran Bible translate it the people? Because if the reading is my people, that implies that God's people are the ones to whom the stroke is due. That God's people, i.e. Israel, are the ones deserving of what's coming down upon the servant. This becomes a problem because the servant is innocent in the text, but he's suffering on behalf of someone else. He's suffering because of someone else's iniquities. Now the anti-missionaries come at this and say, Israel suffers because of the iniquities of the Gentiles, because the Gentiles are sinful towards Israel. They murder us. They are responsible for the Holocaust. We suffer because of their iniquities. But here we're told that my people, or his people, are the ones that deserve it. And this is difficult for, the Masoretic text reading is difficult for what has been the historical position of rabbinic scholars, that the speaker is God, because that definitely identifies my people, God's people, as the figures being redeemed here. Now, his people is even worse, because at least with my people, Rabbi Singer in his theory could say, aha, it's the Gentile kings. Of course, my people instead of our people seems a bit odd unless it's a specific speaker. And why would he, the term my people, it just seems to point us to the people of God. Okay? His people, the passage appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls as his people, is absolutely clear. His people must be Israel. And negates any possibility that Israel could be the servant in these passages, because his people in verse 8 cannot be the same as the servant. They're being contrasted with the servant. It clearly identifies his people as the we, the ones being redeemed. But you don't like it to say my people. You don't even like the Dead Sea Scroll reading his people. That's okay. Just make one up. Let's just change it. Just pull out the eraser and erase the my, and we'll just change it to thee. The people. How can you be so dishonest with the text? How do you do that? How do you just change the text? Just make your problem go away. Like I said, when Rabbi Singer believes that the pro-Messianic, pro-Yeshua Messianic missionaries have done something of this nature, when he believes they have doctored the text, when he believes that the New Testament authors have doctored the text, he makes a big deal of that. He says, hey, they're being dishonest, they're being deceitful, how dare they change the Word of God? Okay, and time after time I've shown that the examples that he gives, when he says that that is happening, it can be demonstrated that Paul hasn't changed anything. He's just dealing with an alternate reading. And if you go and get something like Biblia Hebraica, where you've got footnotes in the Hebrew text that show you all the alternate readings of the various versions and manuscripts of ancient times, you'll see that Paul's hasn't changed anything, or the New Testament writer, Matthew or whatever, hasn't changed anything. He's just quoting a different version than the one that has come down to us in the Masoretic text. Nobody's been dishonest. But here, how do you do this? How do you just take the Word of God, the Tanakh, the most holy book our people possess, and just change it to suit your needs? This is terrible. Why can't you just tell me what it says? Tell me it says my people. I can live with that. I can understand that. I want to deal with that. I don't want you to try and put one over on me and tell me it says the people, so make me shut up and go away. I want to know that it says my people. I want to know that it says that the nation despises the servant in Isaiah 49:7. Don't lie to me. Please, just tell me the truth. Tell me the nation despises the servant, not the nations. Tell me my people or his people, either one, are the redeemed ones, being redeemed by the servant in Isaiah 53:8. Don't tell me it's the people. Okay, now, having gone back and covered some of the material on Isaiah 53 that I should have covered last week, I want to go back over the text of Isaiah 53, and I want to ask ourselves, from the text of Isaiah 52:7 forward, how did our sages of old understand this? Did they believe this spoke of Messiah, or Israel, or someone else? I want to know. Let's first ask ourselves, how did our sages of old recognize the figure in Isaiah 52:7? Remember, we showed that from the poetic structure, the subject matter of Isaiah 53 actually begins in Isaiah 52:7. You really got to go at least up to 52:7 to get the context, because the speaker is presented in Isaiah 52:7. Okay, in Isaiah 52:7 there are phrases that are focused through a poetic structure in Isaiah 52:10 towards Isaiah 53:1, and kicking off the whole message of Isaiah 53. So I want to know, I want to know, how did our sages understand Chapter 52, verse 7, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger of good tidings that announces peace, the harbinger of good tidings that announces salvation, that says to Zion, your God reigns. There is a document called Perek HaShalom, the chapter of Shalom. It is found in certain Talmud editions, and it also is found in Numbers Rabbah 11, 16 through 20. Now, not only does this little document, Perek HaShalom, tie the Messiah in, as we have talked about, or we will talk about in another tape on Isaiah chapter 9, verses 5 through 6, verses 6 through 7 in other in Christian editions. They talk about the Prince of Peace, okay? The topic of this thing is Shalom, peace, okay? It also says, Rabbi Joseph the Galilean says, great is peace, for at the hour the anointed king, or King Messiah, reveals himself unto Israel, he will begin in no other way than peace. As it is written, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger of good news that announces peace. Okay? So the Messiah is revealed to Israel with peace. And this is specifically what is, according to our sages here, being referred to in Isaiah 52:7. Isaiah 52:7 talks about a revelation of peace. Now in Isaiah 52:7, the shalom, or the peace involved, okay, is identical poetically with the salvation. See, he announces peace. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger of good tidings that announces peace. You see that? The harbinger of good tidings that announces salvation. You see that? The peace and salvation are the same poetically. And then you skip down to verse 10. The Lord has made bare his holy arm in the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. The salvation in verse 10, through a chiastic structure of saying the same thing and then saying it backwards, the Lord has made bare his holy arm in eyes of all the nations, and then we back up and say it again and backwards, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. You got three elements there. You got reference to God, you got reference to his holy arm or his salvation, and then the eyes of all the nations, or the ends of the earth, you see? The same thing. So, the salvation of our God in verse 10 is identical, as we've said before over and over, with the salvation in verse 10. The salvation of our God that's being seen. And that's identical in 53, chapter 53, with the arm of the Lord being revealed, which is identical with the report that's being given throughout the text of Isaiah 53. That means that if we understand Isaiah 52, verse 7, in accordance with this document, Perek HaShalom, if we are to understand it in context of the way that our sages have given us, we must understand that the message of Shalom that's given in this passage relates directly to the Messiah. It is about the Messiah. Follow my reasoning here. If we look at the poetic structure, we look at Isaiah 52:7, and we look at what our sages tell us, that the message of Isaiah 52:7 deals with the Messiah, then we must recognize that the figure being spoken of in Isaiah 53:1, that Isaiah 53:1 is about the Messiah. Okay, and the entire text of Isaiah 53 then is this report about the Messiah. Now let us look at the Targum of this passage. Now remember, we've said over and over and again, the Targums were the official Aramaic paraphrases of the Tanakh books. Each of the Targum Onkelos was the official Targum of the Torah, and Targum Jonathan was the official Targum of the prophets. And so, when in the synagogues one would read from the Torah, or one would read from the prophets. Another reader or announcer, depending on when in history this occurred, because the Targums were originally oral and then they were written down, would pronounce the meaning of the text in an Aramaic paraphrase that explained what the official understanding of that text was in Aramaic. And Targum Jonathan of Isaiah chapter 52, starting in verse 15, starting in verse 13. First I will read, just as in ancient times, first I will read Isaiah 52:13 from the Masoretic text, and then I will read from the Targum, in English, of course. Behold, my servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up, and shall be very high. Now let me read you the Targum on this passage that in ancient times, had I read this in the synagogue, would have followed to explain what it meant. Behold, my servant the Messiah shall prosper. He shall be exalted and increase, and shall be very strong. You see, that was the understanding of the text. Our ancient sages of old, Targum Jonathan, by the way, was written by Jonathan ben Uziel, who was the student of Hillel the Great. This gives you an idea of at least according to tradition, how old this Targum text is. Okay? How old this understanding is. 1st century. So the 1st century understanding of this was that it was speaking about the Messiah. The servant is clearly identified as the Messiah in the Targum. Now let's continue on with the text. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to move on down to the announcement of the message in Isaiah 53. Well, no, let's move to Isaiah. Let's go ahead and just read this through. Let's start in 52:13. We already finished that. 52:14. According as many were appalled at you, so marred was his visage unlike that of a man, and his form unlike that of the sons of men. So shall he startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which had not been told them shall they see, and that which they had not heard shall they perceive. The Targum on this passage says, in the last verse of Isaiah 52, it says, not that the kings shall just shut their mouths, it says, kings shall be silent because of him. They shall place their hands upon their mouths. Okay? So it's very, very clear here in the Targum, even more so than in the Masoretic text, that our sages understood the kings here to be absolutely silent. They are not the speaker, according to our sages. All right, let's move on to verse 1. Chapter 53, verse 1. Who would have believed our report, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he shot up right forth as a sapling, and as a root out of dry ground. He had no form nor comeliness that we should look upon him, nor beauty that we should delight in him. Okay? That's the first two verses of Isaiah 53. Now I want to look back here at what Moshe ben Maimonides, or Rambam, said about these passages. He said, regarding the mission by which Messiah will present himself, Isaiah states, quote, he grew like a tender plant and as a root out of dry land. Okay, now that is Isaiah 53, verse 2. For that which had not been at him will kings shut their mouths. For what had not been told unto them shall they see, and what they never heard shall they understand. That's Isaiah 52:15. So definitely he sees this as he saw this as a reference to the Messiah. In fact, Rambam was a contemporary of Rashi. Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhak. Rashi was not the first to propose that this figure was Israel. Of course, even in Isaiah, it is allegorically identified with Israel. But Rashi was one of the first, if not the first, to propose that this figure was only Israel and could in no way be the Messiah. Whereas Rambam disagreed with him. Verse 3. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of pains and acquainted with disease, and as one from whom men hide their face. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. According to Midrash Tanhumi, Rabbi Naaman said that man in this passage refers to the Messiah, the son of David. Let's move on to verse 4. And I'm going to read the next two verses together because verses 4 and 5 have been commented upon over and over again by our sages. Surely our diseases he did bear, and our pains he carried, whereas we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded because of our transgressions. He was crushed because of our iniquities. The chastisement of our welfare was upon him, and with his stripes we were healed. Let me read that here from another translation. This is from the original Bible Project translation. Surely he took up our iniquities, and our pains he carried them. And we considered him beaten, struck of Elohim, and afflicted. And he was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. A chastisement for our wholeness was upon him, and with his wounds there was healing for us. How did our sages understand this very important text? Well, let's look at some of the understandings that they had. Sanhedrin Tractate 98a says, the Rabbanon says that the Messiah's name is the suffering scholar of Rabbi's house, or the leper scholar. For it is written, surely he has borne our grief and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. So here in the Talmud Tractate 98a, it is recognized that Isaiah 53:4 refers to the Messiah. Let's look at another one. Rabbi Huna, in the name of Rabbi Akah, said all sufferings are divided into three parts, and the third to King Messiah. Now that's just kind of vague, but it seems to fit this passage. Sanhedrin 98b, just a little further down in the same tractate as we discussed before. The Messiah, what is his name? The house of Rabbi Yehuda, the Holy One, says, the sick one. Surely he had borne our sicknesses. Referring to Isaiah 53:4 again. Isaiah 53:5, according to Bereshit Rabbah, Rabbi Moshe Hedersheim says, the Holy One gave Messiah the opportunity to save souls, but to be severely chastised. Messiah accepted the chastisement of love. He was oppressed and he was afflicted. And when Israel is sinful, the Messiah seeks mercy on them. By his stripes we were healed, and he carried the sins of many. So clearly, Bereshit Rabbah here applies the text of Isaiah 53:5 to the Messiah. Also in Sanhedrin 98a, again in the Babylonian Talmud, Rabbi Joshua came upon the prophet Elijah as he was standing at the entrance to Rabbi Simon ben Yochai's cave. He asked him, when is the Messiah coming? The other replied, go and ask him yourself. Where shall I find him? He asked. Before the gates of Rome, he was told. "By what sign shall I know him?" he asked. "He is sitting among the poor and covered with wounds." Any good study version will cross-reference that down to Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5. And then probably one of the couple of very profound ones. Let me look here at this is the Machzor for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur from an old copy from the Hebrew Publishing Company that was published in 1931. This is the Musaf for Yom Kippur on page 239 of the 1931 edition. And you're not going to find this in your current Siddurim very often. In fact, I don't think it's in any of them this way anymore. But this used to be there. This is, like I said, an older copy. "Our righteous anointed is departed from us. Horror has seized us, and we have none to justify us. He has borne the yoke of our iniquities and our transgressions, and is wounded because of our transgression. He bears our sins on his shoulder, that he may find pardon for our iniquities. He shall be healed by his wound. We shall be healed by his wound at the time that the Eternal One will create him as a new creature. Oh, bring him up from the circle of the earth. Raise him up from Seir. Oh, to assemble us the second time on Mount Lebanon by the hand of Yinon." The hand of Yinon, or Yinon actually, is one of the rabbinic names of the Messiah according to the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 98b. So the Machzor here recognizes that Isaiah 53 and 52, actually 53, is speaking of the Messiah very clearly. And finally, I want to read a very moving passage from the Zohar. This is from Exodus folio 212a. Okay. "In the Garden of Eden, there is a hall that is called the Hall of the Afflicted. Now it is into this hall that the Messiah goes and summons all the afflictions and the pains and sufferings of Israel to come upon him. And so they all come upon him. And had he not eased the children of Israel of their sorrow and taken their burden upon himself, there would be none who could endure the suffering of Israel in penalty for neglecting the Torah." Now, I'm going to pause there. Realize one of the important things about Isaiah 53 that makes it clear that the servant is not Israel is the fact that the servant in Isaiah 53 is an innocent sufferer. He is being contrasted with us. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. But he is sinless. He doesn't have deceit in his mouth. He is definitely being contrasted and set apart from us as being a sinless one, a innocent sufferer, like a sheep. Okay? And this is not true of Israel. Israel suffers, yes, but Israel doesn't suffer innocently, and Israel doesn't suffer for someone else or because of someone else's iniquities. If you read Deuteronomy 28 and 29, Devarim 28 and 29, or Leviticus chapter 26, both of them really, if you read those passages, you will see, as repeated elsewhere in the prophets also, constantly, Israel suffers not because we are innocent. Israel is not innocent. We suffer not because we volunteer to suffer or because we are willing to suffer, which is the case of the servant in Isaiah 53. We suffer, kicking and screaming all the way, because we violate Torah. Because we as a nation have violated Torah, we suffer. Okay? That's why I go back up to this again. There would be none who could endure the suffering of Israel in penalty for neglecting the Torah. Thus it is written, surely our diseases he did bear, and our pains he carried. As long as the children of Israel dwelt in the Holy Land, They averted all afflictions and sufferings from the world by the service of the sanctuary and by sacrifice. But now it is the Messiah who is averting them from the habitants of the world. So here again we have the Messiah being the one spoken of in Isaiah 53:4 and 5. Let's pick back up with verse 6. All we like sheep did go astray. We turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has made to light on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed, though he humbled himself. He opened not his mouth, as a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and as a sheep that before her shearers is dumb. Yea, he opened not his mouth. According to Pesquita Rabbati, chapters 36 and 37 in Bereshit Rabbati, by Moshe Hadarshan of Narbonne, and I quote, "Then took the Messiah lovingly all the sufferings upon himself." That's from Pesca 36, 142. Okay, so again, we have this being applied to the Messiah. Let's look at, skip on down here to Isaiah 53, verse 10. In Isaiah 53, verse 10, there's a passage that the anti-missionaries make great use of. They get very, very excited about this passage. And that is because they feel that this passage eliminates the possibility that Yeshua is the figure being spoken of. It says, "Yet it pleased the Lord to crush him by disease, to see if his soul would offer itself in restitution, that he might see his seed prolong his days, and that the purpose of the Lord might prosper by his hand." Let me read you this from the original Bible Project translation. And Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh was pleased to crush him. He had caused suffering. Though you make his life a guilt offering, he will see seed. He will prolong days, and the delight of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh will prosper in his hand. Well, the reference here to him seeing his seed, okay, is viewed by the anti-missionaries as a major problem for those that would see Yeshua in Isaiah 53. The anti-missionaries will quickly point to this passage and say, Yeshua died at the age of 33. He did not prolong his days, and he did not see his seed. Well, now, there is in the Dead Sea Scrolls version of this text from Qumran a little bit of a different reading, because we are told in the next verse, "From the anguish of his soul he will see light." That also agrees with the Septuagint translation, the Greek version, from about 200, well, no later than 130 BCE. Okay, so here he sees light. Now, in the Masoretic text, the direct object is simply missing. It says, "He shall see," and the grammar just drops off. So you'll find all kinds of things done to make it work. Of the travail of his soul, he shall see to the full. Okay? That's the JPS version I have. But literally what it's supposed to say is that he shall see light. The implication is that he has died and now he sees light. He's resurrected. This is probably the passage that Paul speaks of in 1 Corinthians 15 verses 1 through 3, where he talks about the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah according to the Scriptures, implying that there was a single passage he had in mind. I think this is it. The death, burial, and resurrection is being portrayed here in Isaiah 53. So he does prolong his days in that he's resurrected. And he does see his seed. Now, what is the seed that he sees? Rabbi Singer would say he doesn't see a seed at all. He says, aha, the Christians or Messianics or whoever is interpreting this passage and speaking about Yeshua as the Messiah will say that it's speaking about his disciples or something like that. But he argues that would be sons, idiomatically can be referred to as disciples in Hebrew. But zarah, seed, is never used that way, he argues. Of course, you can create any kind of allegory that you like. However, what I want to point to here, first of all, is the word zarah can also mean scattered ones, referring to the dispersed, and specifically is used in literature to refer to the scattered or dispersed ones of Israel. However, there's another understanding of zarah here that is given in the Targum. Remember, the Targum tells us what our ancient sages believed these passages meant. And the Targum on this passage interprets the word seed with the phrase, the kingdom of their Messiah. Okay? Now, if that's the case, then seed, the seed that he shall see is the kingdom of the Messiah. That's how it was understood by our sages of old. And I have no objection to that. That fits very well with this passage. So, there is no problem with the word seed here, as it was understood by our sages, to refer to the kingdom of the Messiah. Finally, I want to read Isaiah 53, verse 11. Of the travail of his soul he shall see light. In fact, let me read from the original Bible Project version, because that has the correct grammar supplied here from the Dead Sea Scrolls. From the anguish of his soul he will see light. He will be satisfied. In his knowledge the righteous one will justify my servant to the many, and he will carry their iniquities. This again ties in with what we read in the Machzor. Our righteous Messiah has departed from us. It talks about him bearing our iniquities. In verse 12, therefore I will allot a portion for him among the many, and with numerous ones he will divide spoil, because he poured out his soul to death. He was numbered with the ones transgressing, and he bore the sins of many, and he entreated for the ones transgressing. It is clear when we examine these passages that our sages of old understood Isaiah 52 and 53, particularly Isaiah 53, to speak of the Messiah. The sages express this in the Talmud, in the Midrashim. The actual Targum of the passage begins by saying, my servant the Messiah. The other commentators specify that the message being given in Isaiah 52:7, which can grammatically and poetically be demonstrated to being the message of Isaiah 53, was a message about the Messiah. Even the old Machzor and the old prayer books that was used just a few years ago acknowledged that these passages were speaking about the Messiah. I don't know why it was taken out of the prayer book that way. Maybe because the new theology had it, that the figure was Isaiah. I'm sorry, was the servant was Israel in Isaiah 53, and therefore those passages simply had to be modified out of they were just viewed as being bad information. But for whatever reason, they were removed. And our sages saw these passages speaking about the Messiah. You know, Rabbi Moshe Alshech, he was a 17th century expositor that lived in Safed, Israel. He wrote about these passages. He said, our rabbis with one voice accept and affirm the opinion that the prophet is speaking of the King Messiah, and we shall ourselves also adhere to the same view. The figure of Isaiah 53 has to be the Messiah. It has to be the Messiah because the context requires it. If we go through and we look at the the context requires that it be a suffering figure that redeems Israel. Our ancient sages understood it to speak of the Messiah. In all of the oldest rabbinic literature, the Targums, the Midrashim, the Talmud, the Zohar even, and as we shall discuss in the next tape, when we go look at the Dead Sea Scrolls to see how the ancient Essene community of Jews living at Qumran understood Isaiah, this section of Isaiah, we will discover that they also understood this to speak about the Messiah in a very special way. So in the next step, we're going to really apply this and see how they understood the passage, and you'll be amazed at how clearly they understood this passage of Isaiah 52:7 forward to speak about the Messiah, and in very much the same way that we present it today, or we understand it today, of those of us that believe that it's speaking of Yeshua as the Messiah. In closing, I would like to just leave this with you from the Zohar, referring about the Messiah in Isaiah 52 and 53. In the Garden of Eden, there is a hall that is called the Hall of the Afflicted. Now, as into this hall that the Messiah goes and summons all of the afflictions and pains and suffering of Israel to come upon him. And so they all come upon him. Had he not eased the children of Israel of their sorrow and taken their burden upon himself, there would be none who could endure the suffering of Israel and penalty for neglecting the Torah. Thus it is written, surely our diseases he did bear, and our pains he carried. As long as the children of Israel dwelt in the Holy Land, they averted all the afflictions and sufferings from the world by the service of the sanctuary and by the sacrifice. But now it is the Messiah who is averting them from the inhabitants of the world. Notice what a beautiful picture we have here of the Messiah taking on the sins of Israel. It's real clear who he and we are, who is the servant and who is the redeemed in Isaiah 53 to the author of this material here in the Zohar. He clearly not only sees the Messiah as the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, but he sees the redeemed ones not as the Gentile kings, not as the Gentile world, but as Israel. And so I would just have you think upon Isaiah 53 and upon the understanding our sages had of it and what it means to you. Are we really playing the game that Rabbi Singer accuses us of? Are we painting a target around the arrow after we've already shot the arrow? Or are we shooting at targets that are established messianic prophecies that our sages of old recognized in much the same way that we do? Search it out for yourselves. It's true. Not only does Isaiah 53 speak of the Messiah, but our sages of old knew it. They said so in their writings. Yeshua is the figure of Isaiah 53. When I first became a believer in the Messiah, I called my study partner from my synagogue, a good friend of mine. I called him up. He knew what had happened. He was very concerned about me, going off in this direction. And so I called him up and I said, just let me read this to you. So I started in Isaiah 52, verse 13, and I read all the way through the end of chapter 53. And after I finished, I asked him the same question that we've been concentrating on now for 2 tapes, for 2 entire lectures. I said to him, just after reading the material, and I was reading from my Jewish Publication Society translation, and I said to him, now, please, can you tell me whom is this speaking of? And he says, well, it's speaking about Yeshua, of course, but I don't believe in the New Testament, he tells me. So when I told him where I was reading from, that I was reading from the book of Isaiah, chapter 52, 13 through 53:12, He did not change his position, but what he said was he had a renewed respect for my position. If you were to pick up Isaiah 52:13 through 53:12, not knowing what you were looking at, not knowing that you were looking at a not knowing that you were looking at a passage from the Tanakh, and just to read it and ask yourself, who is this speaking of? Your first reaction would be that it was speaking about the Messiah Yeshua. That was his first reaction. That was the reaction of our sages, who didn't even know it was Yeshua, but they recognized it was the Messiah. I hope that you too can recognize this speaks of the Messiah. And with that, I'll go ahead and close, and we'll begin the next discussion to discuss who the Messiah is, or I'm sorry, we'll discuss whom the figure of Isaiah 52:7 through 53:12 is understood to be at Qumran. Thank you and good night.